a video on Instagram about the death of Floyd, saying she feels broken and disgusted by racism taking place in America. On Monday, Floyd died, as you saw in those visuals, in police custody in Minneapolis after a white officer knelt on his neck during an arrest. That video you just saw there was on her Instagram. Beyonce demanding justice for Floyd in that.
We need justice for George Floyd. We all witnessed his murder in broad daylight. We're broken and we're disgusted. We cannot normalize this pain. And I'm not only speaking to people of color. If you're white, black, brown, or anything in between, I'm sure you feel hopeless by the racism going on in America right now. No more senseless killings of human beings. No more seeing people of color as less than human. We can no longer look away. George is all of our family in humanity. He's our family because he's a fellow American. There have been too many times that we've seen these violent killings and no consequences. Yes, someone's been charged, but justice is far from being achieved. Please sign the petition and continue to pray for peace, compassion, and healing for our country. Thank you so much.
We speak now to SABC Correspondent Nick Harper in the United States. Nick, we saw those raging fires, that is metaphorically and, just really happening across the United States. Those fires being fanned now, it seems, by the U.S. President Donald Trump and some of his comments. Just take us through that.
That's right. As we heard from Chauvin's report a moment ago, there is anger, there is frustration, there is outrage really right across the country. And we have a President Donald Trump, who seems to be fanning those flames. Now, he has talked about George Floyd's death. He has talked about it being tragic and that he will investigate in an expedited manner. But he also tweeted early on this morning, essentially calling for a rally to be held outside the White House behind me later on today from his supporters. In that tweet, he said, "Tonight, I understand, is Make America Great Again night at the White House." That follows on from a Friday night protest that we had at the White House from Black Lives Matters protesters, but also protesters who were out here really to try and show their support for the killing of Floyd. Now, at the moment, we have just a handful of protesters. You may be able to see a couple of people behind me. There's a few more down the block here. We are expecting more later on in the day to show their support for George Floyd. But we may also see Donald Trump's protesters as well. It's unclear exactly whether they will show up and in what type of numbers. But bear in mind that it's only 2 o'clock here in the afternoon. There's still the full extent of the day still to run. And the protests that we have been seeing over the last few nights, the last 4 nights in Minneapolis, they have turned nasty, they have turned violent as we got into the evening hours of nighttime and overnight.
The president praising his own Secret Service agents for what he termed protecting him, but also saying that there will be a retaliation from what he calls the most vicious dogs and the most ominous weapons. What exactly did he mean?
Do not despise the Lord's instruction.
Well, he has been calling out protesters over the last few days, protesters who've been out peacefully on the streets, but also protesters who've been looting and have been carrying out violent acts. And I think there is a clear division in the US, not just shown by the president, but also by other elected officials who are now beginning to denounce those acts of violence. The Minnesota governor, within the last few hours, has been talking about the violence in his state over the last 4 nights and saying that looting, that rioting that we've been seeing, where they've been setting police stations on fire, cars on fire, smashing up retail stores. He said that had nothing to do with the death of George Floyd. It had now gone beyond that, and those peaceful protests were also filled with those more radical elements, those people who were simply there to cause violence. And Donald Trump has, in those tweets, jumped upon that. He called them so-called protesters because there has been that violent wave, that violent influence that we have seen in what have been largely peaceful protests in some other cities across the US.
What is expected across the United States, Nick? As Chauvin was saying earlier on, this is one in a long list of African Americans who've been brutally and publicly killed, murdered. What is the sense? We've seen celebrities also take various social media platforms to speak out against this.
Don't say to your neighbor, go away, come back later. I'll give it tomorrow.
They have been, and as we heard from Beyonce there, they are using that opportunity to use their social media influence, to use the millions of followers that they can reach to put out a message of support for African American communities who have been brutalized by police over the last few years. As we heard in Chauvin's report, a whole litany of black Americans who've been killed at the hands of white police officers, and often those incidents have been filmed. And I think that is something that has obviously grown in prevalence over the last 7, 8, 9 years or so. The fact that people now have mobile phones, that if they're on the scene they're able to film these encounters between black citizens and white police officers, and therefore often these videos become viral, and it shows that there is a level of police brutality that perhaps wasn't able to be evidenced before the technology, before the mobile phones that were out there. Now, obviously bear in mind it's a Saturday afternoon. Last night on Friday there were protests in about 30 cities across the US, big scale protests. Now some of them turned violent, but of course now we're into the weekend. The fear is that we may again see another night of not just protests but potentially also violence, and that is why Minnesota, especially the city of Minneapolis, is stepping up their precautions. They've called in the whole of the National Guard. They'd brought in part of it, but they're now saying that they're going to use the full range of the powers of the National Guard on Saturday evening. The curfew is once again in place. In theory, people from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. the next day should be staying indoors, but that was broken on Friday night. And there are even reports that the Minnesota governor is looking at the possibility of bringing military units in as well to deal with the problems if it escalates once again.
And that could be very worrying indeed, as in how that plays out. Thank you so much, Nick Harper, correspondent in the United States, standing right in front of the White House in Washington, D.C. As you have seen, the anger certainly has spread to other parts of the world. Globally, there has been outrage and anger over this incident.